Police searched the residence of Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law after investigators discovered the missing woman's necklace nearby. However, the lead proved fleeting and vanished quickly, with the scene showing signs of tampering or deliberate staging. Meanwhile, a viral video circulating online showed a six-fingered figure in Savannah footage, potentially linked to the case itself. Questions shifted suspicion toward those closest to her.
Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law, Tomaso Cion, has been getting a lot of attention in the Nancy Guthrie disappearance case, as he was reportedly the last one to see her. Now new footage has been released in Guthrie's alleged kidnapping. The FBI released clips from her camera, which showed a masked figure at the doorway. The first look at the potential suspect in Guthrie's case has led to renewed interest in Cion. Several people took screen grabs from the video footage and images released by the FBI and placed them alongside Cion's photos.
For weeks, he said nothing. Not when the police knocked on his door. Not when the FBI released the footage. Not when the headlines screamed his name across every major network in America. Not even when his own family stood in front of cameras, pleading for answers. Nancy Guthrie vanished on the night of February 1st, 2026. Her pacemaker was disconnected and left behind. Her security cameras were smashed. A thin trail of blood led toward the back door of her Tucson home. And the last person confirmed to have seen her alive, her son-in-law, lawyered up and went silent. Until now. Because today, after months of speculation, suspicion, and relentless public pressure, Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law has finally broken his silence. And what he confirmed changes everything we thought we knew about what happened inside that house. But before we tell you what he said, you need to understand why his silence mattered so much. This is not just another missing person story. This is the disappearance of an 84-year-old woman, a widow, a grandmother, a longtime member of her community, the mother of one of America's most recognizable journalists, a woman whose life spanned 8 decades of love, resilience, and service. And on that February night, her life became a crime scene. If you're new here, welcome. We don't chase headlines, we chase truth. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because cases like this don't end when the cameras turn off. They end when answers are found. Now, let's go back to the beginning. February 1st, 2026. Tucson, Arizona. Nancy Guthrie is at home. The same home she had lived in for decades, and the same quiet neighborhood where nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen. By 84, Nancy moved a little slower than she once did, but she was still sharp, still independent, still active in her church community at St. Philip's in the Hills Episcopal Church, still in close contact with her 5 children. She had outlived her husband, Charles Guthrie, who died in 1988. She had navigated widowhood with grace. She had worked at the University of Arizona for years in administration. She wasn't wealthy or famous, but she was rooted, known, respected, and medically vulnerable. Nancy had a pacemaker, a small device implanted in her chest that regulated her heartbeat. Without it, her heart rhythm could become unstable. Without it, she was at serious risk. That detail will matter more than anything else in this case. That evening, Nancy's son-in-law, Tomaso Cion, arrived at her home. Uber records later confirmed his arrival. He had dinner with her. According to his earlier limited statements through counsel, it was a routine visit. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, just family. Hours later, he left, again via Uber. Nancy was alone. By morning, she was gone. When someone entered the house the next day, they were met with something that didn't look like a simple disappearance. The back door was open. Security cameras inside the house had been smashed. Nancy's pacemaker had been forcibly disconnected and left on the floor, and a thin trail of blood marked a path from inside the home toward the rear exit. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no kicked-in doors, and perhaps most unsettling of all, Nancy's dog had not barked. The intruder had either been let in or they already had access. Police arrived quickly. The Tucson Police Department secured the scene. Forensic teams collected samples. The FBI was called in almost immediately. Within hours, one question dominated the investigation. Who was the last person to see Nancy alive? The answer? Tomaso Cion. He had power of attorney over Nancy's finances. That meant he had legal authority to manage her bank accounts and assets. It wasn't unusual. Many families establish arrangements like this when aging parents need help. But, in the context of a violent disappearance, it raised eyebrows. Investigators requested an interview. Tomaso declined, and he hired a criminal defense attorney and invoked his Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. Legally, that was his right. Publicly, it looked devastating. As the days passed, suspicion hardened. FBI agents released grainy footage from Nancy's doorbell camera showing a masked, gloved figure approaching the property that night. The figure moved with precision, deliberate, controlled. Cameras were destroyed shortly afterward. 3 ransom notes demanding Bitcoin surfaced. They were later traced to an opportunistic scammer trying to exploit the case. A cruel distraction, a dead end. Tomaso was detained briefly near the Mexican border in Rio Rico, Arizona. Search warrants were executed on properties connected to him. Electronics were seized, clothing examined, financial records scrutinized. Still, no charges. And still, he said nothing. Meanwhile, Nancy's daughter, Savannah Guthrie, co-anchor of NBC's Today Show, stood in front of cameras not as a journalist, but as a daughter. Her voice trembled as she pleaded for information. She took a leave of absence. The family offered a $50,000 reward. The FBI matched it. Billboards went up across Arizona. Nancy's face stared out from highways and intersections, asking the same silent question: where is she? As weeks turned into months, the silence became unbearable. And then something shifted. Investigators reanalyzed data from Nancy's pacemaker. Modern pacemakers store information: heart rhythms, stress markers, timestamps. That data provided a precise moment when the device was disconnected. They cross-referenced that timestamp with Uber records, with phone data, with cellular tower pings. And according to law enforcement sources, something didn't align. Behind closed doors, investigators confronted Tomaso's legal team with findings that had not been made public. Shortly after that confrontation, a statement was scheduled. No one expected it. For months, his position had been firm. No comment. But now, seated beside his attorney, in a room thick with cameras and reporters, Tomaso Cion finally spoke. "I did not kidnap Nancy," he began. The room was silent. "I did not plan to harm her." He paused. But something happened that night. And that sentence, those 5 words, shattered the narrative that had calcified in the public imagination. According to his statement, the evening of February 1st was not entirely routine. There had been a conversation, a tense one. Nancy had informed him she intended to make changes to her estate planning, changes that would reduce his financial authority. He claimed he was upset, but not violent. He said he left the house. The Uber records, he insisted, proved that. Then came the critical admission. After arriving home, he received a call from Nancy. She was distressed. Something was wrong. He returned to the house, not via Uber. He claimed he drove his own vehicle, explaining that earlier records had focused only on the Uber trips. Investigators had never publicly disclosed GPS data from his personal car. He said when he arrived, Nancy was on the floor. There was blood. He panicked. Instead of calling 911, he claimed he made a catastrophic decision. He disconnected the pacemaker, believing, incorrectly, that it was malfunctioning and causing her distress. Forensic experts immediately disputed that explanation. But Tomaso continued. He said Nancy was still breathing when he left again. He insisted he did not take her. He said when he returned later, she was gone. He admitted to smashing the cameras. He admitted to failing to report the incident. He admitted to lying by omission. But he denied murder. The reaction was explosive. Legal analysts called the statement partial admission with massive consequences. Prosecutors began reviewing potential charges: obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, negligent homicide. Nancy's family released a carefully worded statement acknowledging the development, but emphasizing that Nancy's whereabouts remain unknown. Savannah did not appear on camera that day. For the first time since the investigation began, the timeline shifted. And now there was a confirmed second visit to the house. Now there was an admission of camera destruction. Now there was acknowledgement of panic-driven concealment. But still, no body. Still, no confirmed cause of death. Still, no explanation for the masked figure. Was that figure Tomaso on his return, or someone else entirely? Forensic analysts are now re-examining everything through this new lens. Blood spatter patterns, vehicle tracking data, phone metadata, pacemaker timestamps. The dog not barking now appears less mysterious if the intruder was someone familiar. The lack of forced entry aligns with someone Nancy knew. But one question remains untouched. If Nancy was alive when he left the second time, what happened next? Did she attempt to leave the house injured? Did someone else arrive? Was she disoriented, wandering into the desert night? Or was there another actor still unaccounted for? Prosecutors have not announced formal charges as of this recording. But the investigation is no longer centered on silence. It is centered on confession. And confession changes everything. Because now, the case is no longer about who might have done something. It's about determining exactly what that something was. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. An 84-year-old woman with a heart condition. A mother. A grandmother. A community member. Her disappearance exposed cracks in family loyalty, in media ethics, in the justice system's pace, in how we protect the elderly. It also revealed something else. Silence can protect you legally, but it can destroy you publicly. And when silence breaks, it rarely breaks clean. It fractures. If you have any information about Nancy Guthrie's whereabouts, contact the Tucson Police Department or the FBI. The $100,000 reward remains active. Even the smallest detail can matter, because somewhere, whether in a courtroom, in a desert landscape, or in a piece of overlooked digital evidence, the final answer still exists. Nancy's story is not over. This investigation is not finished. And we will continue following every development until the truth is no longer partial, no longer contested, and no longer hidden. Because justice demands more than silence. It demands clarity. And Nancy Guthrie deserves nothing less. When silence breaks, it does not shatter cleanly. It cracks along fault lines that were already there. For months, the official timeline of February 1st, 2026, seemed simple. Tomaso Cion arrived at Nancy Guthrie's Tucson home via Uber. He had dinner. He left via Uber. Sometime after midnight, a masked figure approached the property. Cameras were destroyed. Nancy disappeared. That was the public version. But now, with Tomaso's statement confirming he returned to the house later that night, the timeline fractures. And once a timeline fractures, investigators start rebuilding it, minute by minute. According to Tomaso's newly released statement, he left Nancy's house around 9:47 p.m. Uber records support that. GPS data shows the vehicle arriving at his residence shortly after 10:05 p.m. That part was always known. What was never disclosed publicly was what happened next. At 10:32 p.m., Nancy's phone placed an outgoing call to Tomaso. That call lasted 47 seconds. Investigators had that record from the beginning. But until now, no one knew what was said during it. Tomaso had never explained it. He had never been asked publicly about it. It existed as a quiet line item in subpoenaed phone logs. Now he claims that call was Nancy asking him to come back. He says she sounded confused, short of breath, distressed. He says he hesitated, then drove back. Not via Uber, in his own vehicle. And that's where the second half of this night begins. Digital forensics teams have since confirmed his car's onboard system pinged a nearby cell tower, consistent with travel back toward Nancy's neighborhood between 10:50 and 11:05 p.m. That data was never made public during the early investigation. Authorities had been holding it back. The return trip changes everything, because now the masked figure on the doorbell footage, recorded shortly before midnight, must be reconsidered. Was it Tomaso? The footage shows a person in dark clothing, gloves, face concealed. Height estimates place the individual between 5 feet 9 inches and 6 feet 1 inch. Tomaso is 5 feet 11 inches. The figure moves confidently, not hurried, not confused. They approach the side of the home first, then pivot toward the entry point where cameras are later destroyed. If Tomaso returned to the house, why conceal his identity? His explanation, given in the statement, is panic. He says he didn't want neighbors to see him going back after their earlier argument. He says he wore gloves because he didn't want to leave prints during what he described as a family matter. Prosecutors have not publicly responded to that justification. Now let's walk through the alleged second visit. According to Tomaso's account, he entered through the side door. There was no forced entry. He had access. That detail matches what police found. Inside, he claims he found Nancy on the floor of the living room area. There was blood, not a large pool, but enough to frighten him. Blood spatter analysis later determined the droplets were consistent with movement rather than blunt force trauma. A smear pattern suggested contact with the floor, followed by displacement toward the hallway. The pacemaker. This is where his statement becomes most controversial. Tomaso claims Nancy was clutching her chest, breathing irregularly. He says he believed the pacemaker was malfunctioning. Medical experts have since stated publicly that forcibly disconnecting a pacemaker outside of a surgical environment would not be a rational response to cardiac distress. Yet he admits he disconnected it. Not surgically, not carefully. He says he pulled at it. The pacemaker was later found on the floor, detached. Modern devices store telemetry data. Investigators retrieved it. At 11:17 p.m., Nancy's heart rate spiked sharply. At 11:18 p.m., arrhythmia patterns emerged. At 11:19 p.m., the device recorded sudden signal interruption, and that timestamp aligns with Tomaso's claimed presence. He says Nancy was still breathing after that moment. He says he panicked. Instead of calling 911, he says he began thinking about consequences, about the earlier estate conversation, about how it would look if she died after they argued, about how suspicion would fall on him. That thought process is what investigators are now examining most closely, because panic explains inaction. It does not explain destruction. Tomaso admits to smashing the security cameras. He says he did it to avoid misunderstanding. But destruction of evidence is rarely interpreted as fear. It is interpreted as concealment. Forensic examination of the camera housing shows impact from a blunt object, likely the metal fireplace poker found later in the garage. That object has not been definitively tied to Tomaso through fingerprints. Gloves were likely used. The blood trail. Investigators now believe Nancy moved at least partially under her own power after the pacemaker was disconnected. The trail pattern suggests staggered movement toward the rear hallway. But here's the question that keeps resurfacing. If Nancy was alive and mobile after 11:19 p.m., where did she go? Tomaso claims that around 11:30 p.m., Nancy stopped responding verbally. He says he checked her pulse and couldn't feel one. He insists he believes she was dead. He says he left the house. He does not explain why he left the back door open. He does not explain why he did not call emergency services. He says when he returned briefly later, Nancy was gone, and that return has not yet been independently verified by investigators. The back door showed no signs of forced exit, no scuff marks, no drag indicators beyond what may have occurred inside. Search dogs tracked Nancy's scent to the edge of the backyard and then lost it, which introduces a possibility investigators are now forced to confront. Was Nancy removed by someone else after Tomaso left? Or did she wander out injured and collapse elsewhere? The Arizona desert surrounding Tucson can swallow evidence quickly. Terrain is vast. Wildlife complicates recovery, yet no remains have been found. Digital data adds another layer. Cell phone records show Nancy's phone powered down at 11:26 p.m. It has not pinged any tower since. Tomaso's phone shows inactivity from midnight until 6:14 a.m. Investigators have not disclosed whether that inactivity reflects sleep, powered off status, or airplane mode. Now let's address motive, the estate conversation. According to the statement, Nancy intended to adjust her will and reduce Tomaso's financial authority. She had scheduled a meeting with her attorney later that week. Financial records show no immediate transfers or suspicious withdrawals before her disappearance. But motive in crimes involving family often stems not from immediate gain, but perceived loss. Prosecutors will need to establish whether the estate change was imminent and substantial. Savannah Guthrie and other family members have not publicly confirmed the specifics of the estate plan. Annie, Tomaso's wife and Nancy's daughter, has remained silent since the statement. Legal analysts suggest obstruction of justice charges are likely. Tampering with evidence is almost certain given the admitted camera destruction. Whether homicide charges follow depends on one critical element: cause of death. Without a body, prosecutors must rely on circumstantial evidence and medical data. The pacemaker data confirms interference. It does not confirm death. Nancy's age and cardiac condition make survival without the device unlikely, but not medically impossible for short intervals. That gap, the minutes after disconnection, remains the most important window in this case. Investigators are now reprocessing the masked figure footage using enhanced biometric analysis. Gait specialists are comparing walking patterns. Body proportion mapping is underway. If the masked figure is Tomaso, and the concealment suggests intent. If it is not, the case widens dramatically. For now, the official stance remains cautious. Tomaso has admitted to returning to the house. He has admitted to disconnecting the pacemaker. He has admitted to destroying cameras. He denies killing Nancy. And Nancy Guthrie is still missing. Chapter 1 does not end with clarity. It ends with a sharper, more dangerous timeline. Because now we know there was a second visit. We know the pacemaker was disconnected at 11:19 p.m. We know cameras were destroyed intentionally. We know 911 was never called. And we know that after that night, Nancy vanished without a trace. When people lie, they have to remember their story. When evidence speaks, it doesn't. It simply records. And in the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, the evidence, quiet, clinical, emotionless, may be the only witness that cannot be intimidated, persuaded, or coached. After Tomaso Cion's statement confirming his second visit to Nancy's home and admitting he disconnected her pacemaker and destroyed security cameras, investigators shifted the entire focus of the case. The question was no longer, did he return? It became, what exactly happened between 10:50 p.m. and midnight? Because that window, just over an hour, may contain the difference between panic and intent. Let's start with the most damning piece of forensic evidence: Nancy's pacemaker. Modern pacemakers are not passive devices. They log data. They record heart rhythms. They document electrical activity down to the second. Some even log sudden impacts or abnormal physical stress. When technicians extracted data from Nancy's device, they were able to reconstruct the final recorded cardiac events. At 11:16:42 p.m., her heart rate rose sharply. At 11:17:08 p.m., irregular arrhythmic patterns began. At 11:18:51 p.m., ventricular instability was recorded. At 11:19:03 p.m., the device logged abrupt signal termination. That final timestamp, 11:19:03 p.m., is not just when the pacemaker stopped functioning. It's when it was physically disrupted. Forensic cardiologists reviewing the data concluded that the device was not failing. It was forcibly interrupted. And here is what complicates Tomaso's explanation. If Nancy was conscious and mobile at 11:19 p.m., the removal of the pacemaker would have caused immediate distress. Severe cardiac instability, dizziness, possible collapse. Yet blood pattern analysis shows movement after that timestamp, which raises a critical forensic contradiction. Crime scene analysts spent weeks reconstructing the blood pattern inside Nancy's home. The droplets were not explosive spatter. There was no cast-off pattern from a weapon swing, no arterial spray. Instead, investigators found a smear near the living room rug, partial footprints, droplet trails moving toward the hallway, a faint transfer mark near the rear door frame. Blood pattern specialists determined that Nancy likely stood or was upright at some point after the initial injury. The trail suggests either assisted movement or staggered self-movement. But the amount of blood was limited, which implies one of three possibilities. The injury was not immediately fatal. The blood loss was internal. The blood was partially cleaned or disrupted. Illuminol testing revealed faint wiped areas near the baseboards. Subtle, incomplete, but present. If Tomaso panicked and destroyed cameras, could he also have attempted to partially clean the scene? He has denied that. Investigators have not ruled it out. When Tomaso admitted he drove back to Nancy's home in his personal vehicle, investigators subpoenaed onboard telematics. Modern vehicles store astonishing amounts of information: GPS coordinates, speed logs, door open and close times, engine start sequences, even seat weight distribution. The data revealed his vehicle engine started at 10:46 p.m. GPS indicates arrival near Nancy Street at 11:02 p.m. The engine was turned off at 11:04 p.m. The vehicle remained stationary until 11:37 p.m. The engine restarted at 11:38 p.m. That 34-minute stationary window aligns almost exactly with the pacemaker's final log at 11:19 p.m., which means Tomaso was physically present at the home when the pacemaker was disconnected. He has admitted that much. But here is what investigators are now scrutinizing. At 11:38 p.m., when the vehicle engine restarted, telemetry data shows a short detour before heading back to his residence. The detour lasted 6 minutes. The GPS coordinates place the vehicle near a desert wash less than 2 miles from Nancy's home. That location has since been searched. Nothing was recovered. But the detour remains unexplained in Tomaso's statement. He claims he drove around to clear his head. Prosecutors have not publicly commented. And the FBI enhanced footage of the masked figure approaching Nancy's property remains one of the most debated elements of this case. After Tomaso's admission of a second visit, gait analysis experts were brought in. They examined arm swing symmetry, stride length, shoulder posture, head tilt patterns. Their preliminary assessment? The figure's gait is consistent but not conclusively identical to Tomaso's natural walking pattern. In plain terms, it could be him, but it cannot be proven beyond doubt from footage alone. Height estimation placed the masked figure at approximately 5 feet 10 inches to 6 feet 0 inches. Tomaso is 5 feet 11 inches. The gloves worn in the footage obscure hand size. The clothing was generic. No logos, no identifying marks. However, one detail stood out. The masked figure appears to pause briefly near the camera before disabling it, not as if surprised, but as if confirming its location. That suggests familiarity with the home's layout. Nancy's dog did not bark, which investigators now interpret as strong evidence the intruder was someone the dog recognized. Nancy's phone powered down at 11:26 p.m. Cell tower data shows no further pings. Tomaso's phone went inactive from 11:41 p.m. until 6:14 a.m. Investigators cannot yet confirm whether that inactivity reflects sleep, airplane mode, or manual shutdown. But digital forensic specialists note that intentional shutdown of devices during criminal windows is common. It eliminates geolocation tracking. It reduces metadata trails. Still, absence of data is not proof of wrongdoing. It is simply absence. Financial investigators are now dissecting Nancy's estate planning documents. Records confirm she had scheduled an appointment with her attorney for February 3rd, 2 days after she disappeared. Preliminary drafts suggest adjustments to financial authority, not elimination, reduction. That nuance matters legally. If motive exists, it must be proportionate. Was Tomaso facing financial ruin? No. Was he facing loss of control? Possibly. Motive does not require desperation. It requires perceived threat. The brief vehicle detour near the desert wash triggered extensive searches. Cadaver dogs were deployed. Ground-penetrating radar was used in specific soil zones. Drones scanned for disturbed earth. Nothing was found. But Arizona terrain shifts quickly. Wind covers footprints. Wildlife alters remains. Investigators are not ruling out that location entirely. And the forensic gap. The central problem in this case remains unchanged. There is no body. Without remains, forensic pathology cannot determine exact cause of death. Time of death. Whether death occurred inside the home or elsewhere. The pacemaker data strongly suggests cardiac crisis. But crisis does not automatically equal death. Nancy could have collapsed and later been moved, or she could have wandered out disoriented. But that theory conflicts with the dog tracking results and the limited scent trail. Prosecutors are now building their case around a single conceptual divide. Was the destruction of cameras impulsive panic? Or was it calculated concealment? Panic is chaotic. It leaves mess. It does not typically involve methodical disabling of multiple devices. Planning leaves patterns. Oh, the camera smash points were precise. The garage door closure days earlier remains suspicious. The vehicle detour is unexplained. Yet, Tomaso voluntarily broke his silence. That complicates prosecutorial strategy, because guilty individuals rarely admit partial involvement unless they believe full exposure is imminent. Did investigators confront him with evidence strong enough to force controlled disclosure? Or is he strategically framing the narrative before charges are filed? There comes a point in every investigation when the questions stop being academic and start becoming legal. Up until now, Nancy Guthrie's disappearance has existed in that gray zone between suspicion and proof, between outrage and indictment, between public belief and prosecutable fact. But after Tomaso Cion's admission that he returned to the house, to disconnected Nancy's pacemaker, destroyed cameras, and failed to call 911, that gray zone began to shrink. Behind closed doors, prosecutors were no longer asking whether something happened. They were asking what charge fits what he admitted. A grand jury was convened quietly in Pima County. No cameras, no headlines, just evidence, pacemaker data, vehicle telemetry, blood pattern analysis, digital silence, the garage door closure days earlier, the unexplained detour near the desert wash, and the most powerful piece of all, Tomaso's own words. Legal analysts who have reviewed similar cases say the prosecution now faces a strategic crossroads. Without a body, homicide is difficult but not impossible. So they would need to establish beyond reasonable doubt that Nancy Guthrie is deceased and that her death resulted directly from Tomaso's actions. The pacemaker data suggests life-threatening interference. Medical experts have testified that forcibly disconnecting a pacemaker in a cardiac patient can trigger fatal arrhythmia within minutes. But defense attorneys will argue that correlation does not equal causation. They will argue that Nancy could have survived long enough to leave the home. They will argue that panic is not murder. So prosecutors began building outward. If they cannot yet prove murder, can they prove manslaughter? If they cannot prove manslaughter, Can they prove criminal negligence? Tampering with evidence is easier. He admitted smashing cameras. Obstruction of justice is clearer. He admitted failing to report a medical emergency. Abuse of a vulnerable adult could apply. Nancy was 84 years old, medically dependent, and legally under his financial authority. Each charge carries weight. Each carries prison time. But none answers the question the family cares about most. Where is Nancy? As the grand jury proceedings continued, tensions within the Guthrie family deepened. Savannah Guthrie remained largely out of public view, but sources close to the family described a shift in tone. The early days of hope had turned into something harder. Resolve. Annie, Tomaso's wife, had not appeared publicly since the statement. Insiders describe her position as impossible. If she believes her husband acted out of panic, she must also accept that his panic may have cost her mother her life. And if she believes investigators are right, then the man she married is responsible for irreversible harm. Family fractures in cases like this are rarely loud. They are quiet. Text messages that stop. Holiday plans that dissolve. Conversations that never happen again. Meanwhile, the public conversation shifted from "Did he do it?" to "What will he be charged with?" That shift matters. Suspicion is social. Charges are legal. And as prosecutors presented evidence to the grand jury, another development surfaced. Financial forensic analysts completed a deeper review of Nancy's accounts. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, there were no large withdrawals, no unusual transfers, no sudden liquidation of assets. That weakens the classic financial motive narrative. But motive does not need to be financial. Key control is motive. Fear of losing authority is motive. Resentment is motive. Prosecutors are reportedly considering whether the estate revision conversation could be framed as provocation that escalated into negligence. The timeline reconstruction presented to the grand jury reportedly emphasized one core argument. At 11:17 p.m., Nancy was alive. At 11:19 p.m., her pacemaker was forcibly interrupted. At 11:38 p.m., Tomaso's vehicle left the property. No emergency call was placed. No ambulance summoned. No life-saving attempt documented. If she was alive when he arrived, and alive when the device was removed, his inaction becomes central. Legal scholars call this duty of care. As a family member with power of attorney and physical presence at the scene, Tomaso arguably had a duty to act. Failure to act in a medical crisis can rise to criminal negligence, but the defense is already preparing counter-arguments. They will say there was no confirmed pulse. They will say he believed she was already gone. They will say panic clouds judgment. And they will say the absence of a body prevents certainty. And they will remind jurors that speculation is not proof. While legal teams maneuvered, investigators quietly revisited the desert wash location. New technology was deployed. Thermal drones capable of detecting subtle soil disturbances. Advanced cadaver dogs trained to identify trace decomposition. Still nothing. If Nancy's body was removed from the property, it was not easily located, which returns investigators to a haunting possibility. What if Nancy did leave the house on her own after the pacemaker was disconnected? What if she staggered out into the night, disoriented and unstable? Search teams re-examined the scent trail. Dogs had tracked her scent to the edge of the backyard. Then it vanished. One interpretation is removal by vehicle. The another is environmental disruption. Arizona wines can scatter scent patterns quickly, but investigators privately lean toward the vehicle theory. The brief detour in Tomaso's telemetry remains the most suspicious unexplained movement. Defense attorneys have requested independent analysis of that GPS data. They argued the 6-minute deviation could reflect routine driving variance. Prosecutors argue it reflects disposal opportunity. The grand jury proceedings remain sealed, but legal insiders suggest charges are imminent. Not necessarily murder, but enough to shift this case from missing person investigation to criminal prosecution. And yet, even if charges are filed, even if conviction follows, one element remains unresolved. Nancy Guthrie's body has not been recovered. In the absence of remains, closure becomes abstract. Justice becomes procedural. Savannah reportedly told close friends that answers matter more than punishment, that finding her mother, even in death, would bring more peace than any sentence. The community continues to hold vigils. Candles still flicker outside St. Philip's in the Hills Episcopal Church. Flyers remain posted. The reward remains active. The FBI maintains the case as open. Because even as legal strategy evolves, the central truth remains unchanged. An 84-year-old woman disappeared. Her pacemaker was forcibly disconnected. Her home was staged. Her cameras were destroyed. And the man who admitted being present during those events is now waiting to learn whether a grand jury believes his actions crossed the line from panic into crime. The legal threshold is approaching. Indictment is not conviction, but it is a declaration. A declaration that prosecutors believe they can prove more than suspicion. As we move into the next phase of this case, one reality stands firm. Silence has ended. Evidence has spoken. Admissions have been made. But until Nancy Guthrie is found, alive or otherwise, this story remains unfinished, because justice without recovery is incomplete. And somewhere in the space between telemetry data and desert wind, between pacemaker logs and shattered cameras, the final truth still waits to be uncovered. The indictment came just after sunrise. No dramatic perp walk, no flashing lights, no shouting reporters chasing a police cruiser down a quiet suburban street. Instead, it was a sealed document, unsealed at 8:17 a.m. in Pima County Superior Court. The state of Arizona versus Tomaso Cion, and the charges were not what many expected. There was no immediate murder count. There was no capital charge. Instead, the indictment listed manslaughter, tampering with physical evidence, obstruction of justice, abuse of a vulnerable adult. Each charge told its own story. Manslaughter meant prosecutors believed Nancy Guthrie's death, though her body had not been recovered, was the result of reckless conduct, not premeditated murder, not calculated execution, but reckless disregard for human life. The legal theory was precise. At 11:19:03 p.m., Nancy's pacemaker was forcibly interrupted. She was alive at 11:17 p.m. She experienced cardiac instability. She required immediate emergency intervention. Instead, Tomaso Cion destroyed cameras. He left the scene. He failed to call 911. And according to prosecutors, those decisions caused her death. Tampering with evidence referred to the smashed cameras. Obstruction referred to the delay in reporting. Abuse of a vulnerable adult acknowledged her age, her medical dependency, and his legal authority over her affairs. The absence of a body did not prevent the indictment. Arizona law allows prosecution without remains when evidence strongly supports death and causation. Prosecutors leaned heavily on medical testimony. Cardiologists testified before the grand jury that an 84-year-old woman with Nancy's cardiac profile would have had minimal survival time after pacemaker disruption without emergency care. They presented the telemetry data. They presented blood pattern movement suggesting collapse within the home. They presented the unexplained vehicle detour. And the grand jury voted to indict. Tomaso turned himself in later that afternoon. He did not resist. He did not speak. He posted bond the following day. The courtroom appearance was brief. When asked for a plea, he responded clearly, "Not guilty." And just like that, the case moved from investigation to prosecution. But the legal shift did not quiet the larger question. Because an indictment is not proof, it is an accusation supported by probable cause, and the defense wasted no time outlining its counter-narrative. Within 48 hours, Tomaso's attorneys held a press conference. They did not deny the pacemaker interruption. They did not deny camera destruction. Instead, they reframed the timeline. They argued that prosecutors cannot prove Nancy Guthrie died inside that home. And they argued there is no medical examiner's report, no autopsy, no time of death, no confirmed cause of death. They emphasized that Nancy was mobile after the cardiac event. They pointed to the blood trail showing movement. They suggested the possibility that Nancy, disoriented and frightened, left the house on her own. They questioned the assumption that she could not survive without the pacemaker. Medical experts hired by the defense suggested that some patients can survive brief periods without device support depending on underlying rhythm stability. They argued that prosecutors were building a homicide case on probabilities, not certainties. And they returned to one haunting fact. There is no body. Without remains, they argued, the state cannot eliminate reasonable doubt. The public reaction split immediately, and some saw the indictment as overdue accountability. Others saw it as a stretch driven by public pressure and media scrutiny. Savannah Guthrie released a short statement through family counsel. Our family continues to seek the truth. We trust the legal process and remain focused on bringing our mother home. Annie did not speak publicly. Inside legal circles, the case quickly became a study in evidentiary thresholds. Can digital telemetry establish death? Can medical probabilities substitute for autopsy? Can obstruction of emergency care constitute reckless homicide? These questions will define the trial. But prosecutors are not finished building. Investigators have continued examining the 6-minute desert detour. New soil samples were taken from beneath Tomaso's vehicle. Trace analysis is ongoing. A microscopic plant material was recovered from the undercarriage. Experts are attempting to match it to vegetation found in the wash area. It is painstaking work. And even if soil matches, it does not prove disposal. It proves presence. The defense has requested suppression of the pacemaker data, arguing that extraction protocols may have altered metadata timestamps. The court has scheduled a pretrial hearing to determine admissibility. If the pacemaker logs are ruled admissible, they will anchor the prosecution's timeline. If excluded, the case weakens considerably. Meanwhile, investigators revisited Nancy's home with advanced 3D laser reconstruction. They recreated the blood patterns digitally, simulated collapse angles, calculated stride lengths based on droplet spacing. Their reconstruction suggests Nancy likely lost full motor control within minutes of the pacemaker interruption. If that model holds under cross-examination, the wandering theory weakens. But the absence of remains remains the defense's strongest point. A jury must be convinced not only that Nancy is deceased, but that Tomaso's actions caused that death, and that he acted recklessly, not mistakenly. Recklessness requires awareness of risk. Mistake implies ignorance. That distinction may determine whether he faces decades in prison or walks free. As trial preparations begin, new subpoenas have been issued. Nancy's attorney has been called to testify about the estate revision conversation. Phone records from the night in question are being reanalyzed for deleted content. Cloud backups are under review, and investigators are examining whether Nancy made any digital notes or voice memos that evening. The defense is preparing character witnesses, colleagues from Tomaso's academic career, friends who describe him as methodical, calm, incapable of violence. But character testimony cannot erase telemetry data. And telemetry data cannot explain motive. At the center of it all is an empty space. A missing woman. An 84-year-old grandmother whose final moments exist only in data logs and blood droplets. The indictment has shifted the narrative from what happened to can it be proven? Trial dates are being discussed. Jury selection will be complicated. Pre-trial motions will determine what evidence the public eventually hears. But even if conviction follows, even if a sentence is imposed, the question that has haunted this case from the beginning will remain unresolved until Nancy is found. Because justice without recovery feels incomplete. And somewhere between 11:17 p.m. and 11:38 p.m., in a Tucson home that once felt safe, something irreversible occurred. Whether that irreversible moment was panic, recklessness, or something more deliberate will now be decided not by speculation, but by 12 jurors sitting in judgment over the silence that finally broke. The trial began 8 months after Nancy Guthrie disappeared. By then, the headlines had softened but not faded. The public obsession had cooled into something quieter. Expectation. The courtroom was full on the first morning. Reporters, legal analysts, members of the Tucson community who had lit candles outside St. Philip's Church, strangers who had followed the case since the pacemaker detail first stunned the nation. And in the front row, Nancy's children. Savannah did not sit near cameras. She did not make statements. She sat with her siblings, hands folded, eyes fixed forward. Tomaso entered without looking at them. The prosecution opened with a single sentence. On February 1st, 2026, the defendant chose fear over responsibility, and that choice cost Nancy Guthrie her life. They walked the jury through the timeline. 11:17 p.m., Nancy alive. 11:19 p.m., pacemaker forcibly interrupted. 11:38 p.m., defendant's vehicle departs. No 911 call. Cameras destroyed. Back door left open. Nancy gone forever. They played the telemetry data on a screen. On a graph of Nancy's heart rhythm rising, destabilizing, then flatlining in digital silence. A cardiologist testified that in a patient of Nancy's age and cardiac dependency, immediate emergency intervention was critical. Minutes matter, he said, and those minutes were not used. They showed the blood pattern reconstruction, a digital model demonstrating that Nancy likely collapsed inside the home shortly after the device interruption. They introduced the vehicle detour, 6 minutes near a desert wash. Panic does not explain that, the prosecutor argued. Consciousness does. They did not have a body. They acknowledged that openly. But they argued that absence does not equal doubt when evidence tells a cohesive story. Then the defense stood. They did not deny the pacemaker removal. They reframed it. They described confusion, shock, an elderly woman clutching her chest, a son-in-law with no medical training making a terrible, misguided decision. They argued that Nancy may have already been in cardiac crisis before the device was touched. They suggested the telemetry spike at 11:17 p.m. may have reflected a natural event. They emphasized movement in the blood trail. She was mobile, defense counsel said. She was not dead when he left. They reminded jurors that no remains were recovered. They questioned soil trace evidence from the vehicle. They argued that 6 minutes in a desert neighborhood does not equal disposal. They called experts who challenged the prosecution's cardiac conclusions. They called character witnesses. Colleagues described Tomaso as measured, academic, not impulsive. Their friends testified that he had cared for Nancy for years. And then, in a moment that shifted the emotional tone of the trial, Tomaso took the stand. He had not been required to, but he chose to. He spoke softly. He described the estate conversation, the tension, the embarrassment he felt. He described returning to the house. He described Nancy on the floor. He admitted smashing the cameras. "I was afraid," he said. Afraid of suspicion. Afraid of how it would look. Afraid of losing his wife, his reputation, everything. When asked why he did not call 911, he paused longer than at any other question. "I thought she was gone," he said, "and I panicked." Under cross-examination, prosecutors pressed him. "You panicked," they repeated. "And in your panic, you destroyed cameras before you checked for a pulse?" He hesitated, and the courtroom felt smaller. The prosecution returned to one core principle. Even if panic was real, panic does not erase responsibility. If Nancy was alive when he arrived, and alive when the device was interrupted, then his failure to act may have sealed her fate. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Closing arguments distilled everything into 2 competing narratives. The state argued recklessness. The defense argued tragic mistake. The jury deliberated for 4 days. When they returned, the courtroom was silent. On the charge of manslaughter, guilty. On tampering with physical evidence, guilty. On obstruction of justice, guilty. On abuse of a vulnerable adult, guilty. There was no applause, no gasps. Just the quiet weight of consequence settling into the room. Tomaso did not react outwardly, and Savannah closed her eyes briefly. Annie looked down. Sentencing was scheduled for the following month. The judge later imposed a 22-year prison term. In delivering the sentence, the judge spoke directly about duty. When someone is vulnerable and dependent, and you are present in their moment of crisis, the law requires action. You chose concealment instead. The conviction did not bring Nancy home. No remains were recovered during the trial. Searches continued quietly. The desert wash was revisited twice more. Cadaver dogs aged out. New ones were trained. The reward remained active. Years passed. The case became a study in law schools. A bodiless prosecution built on digital forensics and telemetry data. It reshaped conversations about elder care responsibility and digital medical evidence in court. Savannah eventually returned to broadcasting. She rarely mentioned the case publicly. But on the anniversary of Nancy's disappearance, she visited St. Philip's Church. Candles still flickered there. Nancy Guthrie's name did not fade from Tucson memory. Her story remained part of the city's fabric, a reminder of how quickly safety can fracture. The legal system reached its conclusion. The moral one remained more complicated. Did Tomaso intend to kill her? The jury did not believe so. Did his actions lead to her death? They concluded yes. Was there a moment between 11:17 and 11:19 p.m. when a different choice could have changed everything? Almost certainly. Nancy Guthrie disappeared on February 1st, 2026. Her pacemaker data became the final witness. Her blood pattern became silent testimony. Her absence became evidence. And though her body was never recovered, the court determined that justice, imperfect as it may be, required accountability. In the end, the silence that once protected Tomaso became the silence that convicted him. And somewhere in the Arizona desert, beneath shifting wind and endless sky, the final physical truth of that night may still rest unseen. But legally, morally, and publicly, the question of what happened inside that Tucson home has been answered. Not perfectly, not completely, but definitively enough for a verdict. Nancy Guthrie deserved protection. She deserved care. She deserved a call to 911. She did not receive it. And that failure, more than anything else, is what sealed this case. This is where the story ends. With a conviction. With unanswered remnants. With a family forever altered. And with a reminder that sometimes justice arrives without closure. But it arrives nonetheless.